for Christmas is a dog.
Christmas is a puppy and family.
All I want for Christmas is a puppy.
This is a puppy.
I want a puppy. All I want for Christmas is a puppy dog.
A puppy.
All I want for Christmas is another cat.
All I want for Christmas is a glowing and the dog glow.
The popular choice this year. So I don't know how I feel about that as a parent. I don't know about the other parents, but all right, we'll go ahead and dismiss the kids. Thank you for sharing what you want for Christmas with us. So they're going to head upstairs for Children's Church, and we're going to kick off a new series that'll last through December this year. So after December, we'll get back into the book of Acts in January, but we're just going to spend some time thinking about what we want for Christmas. And so, it's not two front teeth probably for most of you. But I want us to take some time over these next weeks to really think about our desires. Really think about the things we care about. Really think about deep down, what are the things we want? And think through those things. Today we're talking about hope. Next week we're going to have Sam here with us, who's interning over at Danvers, and he's going to share with us about all I want for Christmas is for things to stop changing. Anybody ever feel like that? Maybe that's some of you this year, that all I want for Christmas is things to stop changing. And then the week before Christmas, we're going to talk about how maybe all we want for Christmas is lasting joy. There are things that maybe make you happy in life, and it just comes and goes and comes and goes, and happiness then sad and happiness then sad. What about lasting joy? We're going to be thinking about that the Sunday before Christmas. So we're thinking about the things we want for Christmas, but really it's not about Christmas, is it? It's just about life. So we're talking about hope today. Hope. What do we do with hope? You can give up hope, can't you? You can give up hope. Stop trying to hope. Maybe similarly to that, you can just kind of ignore it, just protect yourself from it. I've hoped before and been let down, and so I'm just not even going to let myself kind of hope. I just won't even let myself go there. Kind of a self-preservation thing. So we can give it up. We can just kind of choose to not think about it. We can try to maintain it. We can try to say, I want to keep hope up. I want to be a hopeful person. I don't want to be hopeless. And so we can just try to put things in our lives, circumstances, people, stuff in our life to try to just keep it up, keep up hope, keep up hope. So you're just kind of like a cheerleader for yourself saying, be more hopeful, be more hopeful. Maybe we can seek it out by many different ways. We can seek hope through many things. And we can find hopefulness in some ways through many things, but it doesn't usually last. Or instead of all of those other things, and maybe other things came to your mind when you think about hope, instead of all of those things, maybe we can receive it from God by faith. And maybe that hope actually will last. Maybe that hope will actually drive us through all of our life, no matter what happens. And we say that now, don't we? Sometimes as Christians, we say things like, Lord willing, and with coronavirus, we mean that, don't we? We've been taught to actually say, here are my plans, but God, do whatever you want with it. Hope has to do with expectation, doesn't it? If you've studied through the Bible at all about hope, it has to do with expectation. You see, the Bible is God's word, right? That's not a surprising thing to hear at church. It's what God wants us to know. God makes promises in his word. And he wants us to hear those promises, receive them by faith, and expect God to keep his promises. And when we connect with him by trusting him, trusting that he will keep his word and holding him to that by faith with humility, we expect a God who will do what he says he will do. Have you ever had a relationship where you expected somebody to do something that maybe they told you they would do and then they didn't? Maybe it was on purpose because they chose not to. Maybe it was just because they got so busy they forgot. So I'm not trying to make a commentary on whether it's malicious or not. I'm just saying humans will eventually always let you down in some way, right? Simply because we're not perfect. Simply because our minds can be easily distracted. Simply because we can get sucked into temptations at times. But God never does he? Jesus overcame every temptation. He doesn't get sucked into that. His mind is perfect. He knows all things and holds all things together. When he makes a promise, will he keep it? The expectation that grows within us is hope. When we think about hope, we are not talking about wishful thinking. We saw that on the video. We're not talking about just, well, maybe this will work out. I hope this will happen, meaning, well, I wish if I had anything I wanted, this would happen. Biblical hope is different. Biblical hope is when we know who God is, we know what he's doing, we attach ourselves, our hopes, our dreams, our joys, our expectations to that, and it stirs within us these feelings of, yes, God is going to overcome. He's going to do what he promised he will do. He's going to one day fulfill all of my longings for joy. He's going to fulfill all of my longings to be known. He's going to fulfill all of the things I want deep down. What do you want deep down? That's what we're thinking about. What do you want deep down? Maybe you've let your desires and what you want be attached to things that aren't from God. You've sought out hope in other ways. Think about it. Let God search you today as we think through this together. We're going to hear a story that happened in the early 700s BC. That was a long time ago. So you got to kind of in your head go back a long time, early 700s BC. It was a story of a people who felt like the world was kind of closing in on them, who felt hopeless, who were stricken with fear, who didn't see a way out of a jam they found themselves in. They knew God was great. They knew God had given them promises. They knew they should expect God to be who he said he would be. But they had a hard time actually seeing how that helped them in their current situation. And so they struggled with that. We find this story in Isaiah chapter 8. I want to kind of give us the lay of the land, and we'll meet the characters first. And so I have a map we'll be able to look at here, kind of just help you visualize it, because I realize when I say, hey, just imagine 700s BC, that's hard to do. So let's try to wrap our heads around this a little bit before we jump into the story. So I want to give you the lay of the land and introduce you to the characters in the story, and then we'll work through it here together. And so you see here up on the screen, there are 3 different arrows to 3 different places. There's Judah, which is in the green. There's Israel, which is in the kind of pinkish red in the middle. And then there's Aram all the way up to the north of the map there. So there are several different names you need to know in this story. And so Rezin was the king of Aram all the way up in the north. So that was also called Syria at times, not to be confused with Assyria. There's also Pekah. He was the king of Israel, or the northern tribes of Israel. And there was Ahaz, the king of Judah, or the southern kingdom of Israel. And then, who can pronounce the next name? Tiglath-Pileser. He was the king of Assyria. Assyria was so overwhelmingly huge at this time in history that this map doesn't even show half of Assyria. All of these other kingdoms are under Assyrian rule at this time. Then we have, if you thought Tiglath-Pileser was hard to pronounce, look at this next one. Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. This is a son of Isaiah, and God asked Isaiah to give him this name on purpose. It means quick to plunder and swift to spoil. Crazy name, huh? I'm glad when I named Gabriel, my son, that God didn't say, hey, name him Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, Shearer. Imagine writing that on your paper at school, huh? But God wanted Isaiah to name his son this as a sign to Israel. That they sought out hope. They tried to solve their problems through political means, through alliances with other political entities. They sought to find their hope through bringing in other religions and ways of worship that had nothing to do with God. They sought to find out their hope in many ways, except for by listening to God's word and receiving it. And this name was a very clear sign of that. It means quick to plunder, swift to the spoil. Judgment was coming for this people, is the point. And it was coming quickly, swift. God was saying, I am offering you this amazing hope. I'm offering you this amazing, my very presence to help you through situations like this, and you don't want me. And I'm offering myself again and again and again and again and again and again, and you don't want me. Do you know what the consequences are for rejecting a hope that will never fail you? You will settle for things that will fail you. And the very ways in which they sought out hope will be the very ways in which will come against them as judgment. So they will see that they were worthless and would not last. They were living in fear. They had many reasons to fear. The times in which they lived, they were caught between two opposing views or two opposing movements. So Judah is the people we're talking about in the story here today. So you can see this down in the green section. This is King Ahaz. We're going to hear about him. We're going to hear about the people of Judah today. And they were caught in a hard position. What was happening is, remember I said Tiglath-Pileser, Assyria, was ruling the entire area. He was not a nice guy. This was not a nice people. They were a very vicious, rule with an iron fist kind of people. So what happened is you had the king of Aram in the north, the king of Israel in the north, said, all right, we're going to rebel. We're going to stand up against Tiglath-Pileser. We're going to show him that he can't take our hope from us. He can't tell us how to live our lives. He can't take our freedom from us. Who does he think he is? Now, Judah is right next to them. They're putting the pressure on Judah and saying, join our alliance. If you want to have freedom to worship the way you want to, which they didn't really want to worship God in freedom, but that's what the narrative was. And so he was saying, if you really want to have the freedom to worship God the way you want to, join us and we will fight for this cause. Without praying, without asking God, just developing their own plans. And they were putting pressure on Ahaz and on Judah. In chapter 7 of Isaiah, it actually talks about how they were planning to set up a puppet king and pull Ahaz out. So Ahaz's world is closing in on him. In fact, the kings before him, and you can see the kingdom of Judah used to be at least twice as big. Here you have a king. He's, all right, I'm in charge. I'm the man. But my kingdom is like less than half of what it used to be. How are you feeling right now? Expectations of the people on you. How are you feeling? Your world is starting to close in. Now you have two forces who are right near you who want to come in, overthrow you, and set up a puppet king because you won't go in with their alliance. And so there's pressure on him, and he has a choice, doesn't he? He either gives in to what they want or he trusts God. And in the chapters surrounding this, God comes and says, I want to give you a sign. I want to show you that I will fight for your people, and I will be your God, and you will be my people, and I will be God with you. I will be Emmanuel. My presence will guide you. All the kingdoms of the earth will know that I'm your God. And what greater offer of hope is there? And yet Ahaz couldn't get his eyes off of the pressures of life and how these problems were closing in on him to see this promise of hope from God. That's where we are here. Now, if you're not there already, please turn to Isaiah chapter 8 with me. We see what's happening here is chapter 8, verse 6. God gives us this word picture to help see what's really going on. And he says, inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah and rejoice in Rezin, the son of Remaliah. So there's, on the one hand, there's gently flowing waters. On the other hand, there is Rezin. You remember who he is? He's the king of Aram in the top. He's the mover and shaker of the movement against Assyria at this time. And what God is saying here is he's saying, you've rejected me, the flowing waters of Shiloah, of peace. You have rejected the gentle, flowing waters, the provision of my presence, the hope that I'm offering you. And you're actually attaching your joy to these plans of Aram, these plans of Rezin, this other king. And you're finding your hope, you're finding your joy there because you're rejecting the goodness of my presence. So in the process of all of this, they're attaching their hope and joy to a human and a godless situation. When I say the word godless, I think sometimes as Christians we assume, oh, godless just means all those people who are like very against God and the atheists and that kind of thing. Godless in the Bible just means anything you do without God. Do you make any plans without God? Make any preparations without God? So let's sit with this morning. On the one hand, you have an offer from God from his presence that is described as the gentle flowing waters that should be our joy. On the other hand, there's all the ways in which the world offers us to make plans, to do preparations, to move forward with life, solve our problems, find our hope, not from the springs of God's presence, but from other ways. So in the process of attaching their hope and joy to a human and godless situation, that's where we find them in this verse. Verse 9, we see that their preparations were not filled with the gently flowing waters of God's presence. So they didn't see any joy in it. Listen to these words. Be broken, O peoples, and be shattered, and give ear all remote places of the earth. Gird or prepare yourselves, yet be shattered. Gird or prepare yourselves, yet be shattered. Why do you say that twice? He wants us to hear it. He's saying, make your preparations. Guess what's going to happen to them? They're going to be shattered. Make your preparations, plan, solve your problems, deal with your frustrations without the satisfaction of my presence, and your plans, your preparations are going to be shattered. So we see the preparations in verse 9. We see the plans and the proposals in verse 10. He says, devise a plan, but it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand. Do you hear what God is saying? I hope you hear this. It's very clear. Any preparations, any proposals, any plans we make that are not from the overflow of enjoying His presence will be shattered, will be thwarted, will fail. You will not find your lasting hope there. And they will not be accomplished the way you think they will. Proverbs 19:21 says, many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord is what's going to stand at the end of the day. We can have all kinds of plans, right? But what is it that will stand and will never fail? It's God's counsel. It's God's plans. It's what God is accomplishing. And then 2 verses later, it says in verse 23, the fear of the Lord leads to life, so that one may sleep satisfied, untouched by evil. So on the one hand, we have this offer from God of His very presence, saying, I want to offer you this gentleness, this joy. I'm offering you life so that you will be satisfied. You will sleep. It's not saying you won't have physical ailments that might wake you up in the middle of the night, but it is saying that fear will not keep you up at night. Does anybody need to hear that? Fear will not keep you up at night. You will sleep satisfied, untouched by evil, because you've taken these plans that you were trying to develop and carry out without ever enjoying the presence of God or even asking Him what He wants. You're laying them aside, confessing them as the wrong and sin that they are, and saying, God, I want to be filled with your goodness and your plans and your counsel, because that will be left standing at the end of every single day. So when you wake up in the morning, you have both choices, right? I have problems in life. I have things I need to accomplish. I'm feeling hopeless. I want to hope. I'm feeling frustrated. I need to solve this problem. Are you making preparations, proposals, and plans, devising them in your heart from outside of the presence of God? On the one hand, that's your choice. Do it in His presence with joy, because His plans will be standing at the end of the day. Or you can engage in this plan without God, and it will fail. It will fail. Chapter 8, verse 10, devise a plan, but it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand. And look at this last phrase, for God is with us. He's trying to get your attention off of the problems you're seeing. You see, Ahaz and his people they're actually described in chapter 7, verse 2, that they were shaking. They were shaking like leaves blow in the wind. Especially in the fall when they start to dry out, you can almost hear them shaking in the wind sometimes. They're like crackling in the wind. They're shaking. Ahaz and the people of Judah were so full of hopelessness and fear that they were literally, they felt like their whole world was shaken and closing in on them. And it was just, what do I do? I don't see any other way out. This alliance to our north is all there is. God, this must be your plan for us. Let's just do it. And that's exactly what they tried to do. And God says, that wasn't my plan. You just said it was my plan. Big difference. Big difference. So I have a couple questions for us to think about. Number one, are my preparations, plans, and proposals saturated and overflowing? Listen to those two words. So your plans, preparations, proposals, all of that, are they saturated with and overflowing with the gently flowing waters of God's presence? Are they? Think about it. Think about when you make plans. Think about when you try to solve problems. Think about when you try to make yourself more hopeful, make yourself happier. Are those preparations you make, are those plans, are those proposals saturated with and overflowing with the gently flowing waters of God's presence? When we look at life, things can seem hopeless, can feel like things are closing in on you. It can seem like there is no other way. It seems like there isn't any way to solve this problem. It's impossible. And you can either say that from a place of shaking with fear or hopelessness, or you can say that from a place of being filled with the gentleness and joy of His presence and say, I see what's happening, God. It seems impossible. Maybe it's not that the Assyrian king is, there's a rebellion and I'm going to get caught in the crossfire and killed. Maybe it's something else that's difficult for you. Maybe it's your job. Maybe it's a relationship in your family. Maybe it's a relationship with a neighbor or a friend. Whatever it is, we can make plans. We can create narratives in our mind and say, this is just the way it's going to be. We can sit in the presence of God and hear His word and let Him fill us with hope. Second question. Am I attaching my joy and hope to plans that may be logical without realizing the absence of the hope and joy of God's presence? So what I'm saying there is, or what I'm asking there is, I can make plans and they can be very logical. And I can have a Bible verse to say why it's a good plan. And all the meanwhile, I can maybe just be ignorant to the fact that I'm missing the hope and joy of God's presence. Are you doing that? I'm not saying assume you have His joy in His presence or hope and joy in His presence. I'm saying, do you know? You see, we have a picture in the Old Testament that Israel had of the sanctuary, or the Holy of Holies we're going to see in the text here this morning. There's a picture, and they had to actually go in there. Do you actually take time and in your prayer life go in to the presence of God? Hebrews tells us to do that. It says, for every trouble you have, there's a perfectly well-timed grace. Do you want it? Do you want God's perfectly well-timed grace and help for your troubles? Do you go into His presence to find them? Because it's there. It's a promise. You can expect it there and be filled with hope, or you can just live with the ignorance of not even knowing you're missing it. That's my question. That's my question. And so as we engage in life, as we engage with problems, as we try to just stir up hope, all of these things, there's two options. We can either let the words and ways of the world shape us, or we can let the words and ways of God shape us. And that's what we see in verses 11 through 22. As we look through this, verse 11 says, for thus the Lord spoke to me with mighty power and instructed me not to walk in the way of this people. So we can either let the words and ways of the world shape us, or we can let the words and the ways of God shape us. And here's the big idea for today, or the key concept. Hopelessness and fear are overcome by receiving and rejoicing in the gift of God's presence. I'm going to say that again. Hopelessness and fear are overcome by receiving and rejoicing in the gift of God's presence. Hopelessness is rampant in our culture. And we seek to drown it out in our culture with noise, with more stuff to do, with more things to watch, with more music to listen to, with more TikTok videos to create, with more Facebook posts to read, to make, with more books. We try to drown it out instead of identifying it as hopelessness and then saying, God, I feel hopeless. Do you actually offer me the gentle flowing streams of your presence? Do you actually offer me Emmanuel, God is with us? Do you actually offer me this gift that if I receive it by faith in your Son, that I have access into your very throne room in prayer? Do I actually have that? But it starts with identifying the feelings of hopelessness, right? Starts with identifying the fears that come in. Ahaz and the people of Judah just reacted to this fear of what was happening. They didn't identify it before God and say, okay, God, what do you want to do? What do you promise me as an alternative? And so in verses 11 through 14, here's the first principle we see, is that what we make most dominant in our circumstances affects and directs our worship. Picking up at verse 12, he says, you are not to say it is a conspiracy in regard to all that this people call a conspiracy, and you are not to fear what they fear or be in dread of it. It is the Lord of hosts whom you should regard as holy, and he shall be your fear, and he shall be your dread. Then he shall become a sanctuary. What we make most dominant in our circumstances affects and directs our worship. So in other words, you can come into church and sing songs and say, God, be pleased with my great worship. But all week, you can have something else as more dominant in your thinking, in your feeling, in your hopes, in your joys. You can be attaching your hopes and joys to something else, making plans without God, doing things. You can see a problem in your life as just the biggest thing, that's what you think about before you go to sleep. That's what you think about when you wake up. That's the thing that if ever you're sitting in silence without the radio on, without the TV on, with just no noise, those are the thoughts that come in. It's something more dominant than God. Now for Ahaz, this is actually speaking to Isaiah at this point, where God is saying to Isaiah, look, Ahaz, all of the people of Syria, they're making up lies about you. They're saying you're a conspirator. You may have heard those words when I read it and said, what is he talking about, a conspiracy? Well, Isaiah was trying to speak truth into the middle of all of this, and they were saying, this guy is a conspirator. He's trying to get us to turn against God. And you see how words can get twisted so easily? It can get twisted so easily. And here's the thing, is we can start to believe the narratives we hear, even though if we know they're not true. Isn't that right? We can know something's not true, but when you hear it day after day after day after day after day after day after day, eventually you're like, am I the crazy one? Maybe I'm wrong. And Isaiah is here bringing a word from God saying, no, don't make this alliance. Trust God to save you. Simple, clear message, right? And yet somehow he needed God to say to him, don't believe what they're saying. They're telling you you're the conspirator who's trying to get them to turn away from God, and don't listen to Isaiah. And Isaiah's like, maybe they're right. And God speaks with clarity and boldness right to Isaiah and just says, don't listen to those narratives. Be careful what you let come into your ears. It will drive you to fear and it will drive you to hopelessness. What is most dominant in your life will direct and affect your worship. So if you live all week long hearing other narratives, other things, that when you go to sleep, that's what you're thinking about. When you wake up, that's what you're thinking about. When you're quiet, that's what you're thinking about. And it's not God. It's not the gentleness and joy of His presence. That affects your worship. That affects your worship. And that's what we see here. As it goes on, he's saying, first of all, be careful about these narratives. And then he says, don't fear what they fear. Just don't. Because you will if you don't listen to God instead. Maybe you all think you're strong enough and mature enough in Christ to just, I'll never buy into that. But I'm telling you, because I love you, you're not. You're not strong enough, and I'm not either. God's word is. Do not attach your hopes to your strength. Do not attach to hopes to your wisdom and knowledge and intellect. Do not attach to your hopes to how many Bible verses you know. Attach them to God and what He says. That is it. Let God be your greatest joy before you fall asleep. And if you can't get there because all these other thoughts and words or even voices come into your head, just pray and press into His presence and find that offer of grace that's perfectly timed for your help right then. And if when you wake up, you immediately feel fear or hopelessness or anxiety, you seek God and say, you promised gentleness and joy and sanctuary in your presence. I don't want this hopeless and I don't want this fear. I want you. Make God your most dominant thing all week long. Verse 14 says that if you do this, He will be a sanctuary to you. He will be a set apart, unique, holy place. Anybody just ever feel like you want to get away? You want a vacation? Even be careful about that. Now that's a good thing. I'm not going to say that's a bad thing, but what I'm going to say is be careful. Because God is supposed to be our set apart place. That's what that verse says. He will become to you a sanctuary or a set apart holy place. When you feel like Ahaz felt like the world was closing in on him, he was shaking in fear, he didn't see any other way out. When you feel that way, the answer isn't run away. The answer is run to God. The answer is no matter where you are, if you say, I feel hopeless, I just need to get away, life is crushing me, all I need is one day of vacation, one day off, and God and your employer says, no, you can't have it. What do? Do you get angry at your employer and angry at God and say, why is life so hard? Or do you run into His presence and say, you are my sanctuary, God. I will not believe those narratives. I will not let anything else be more dominant in my life. I will run into the joy of your presence and find the gentleness that's there. Jeremiah 17:12. I love this verse. It says, a glorious throne on high from the beginning is the place of our sanctuary. From the beginning, unending, always there. God's never changing. This offer will never go away in this life until Christ returns. And then we'll be with Him physically, which is even better. This is a lasting promise for us, a glorious throne on high. The presence of God Himself is the place of my vacation. That is the place of my rest. That is the place that is set apart. When I feel like just engaging in the world, I just hear all this stuff that is so ungodly. It's just, I feel dirty almost. How do you get clean? A glorious throne from on high is the place of my sanctuary. What we make most dominant in our circumstances affects and directs our worship, whether you admit it or like it or not. The second principle in verse 14 through 18 is when it seems that God's purposes have failed, they haven't. Is that good to hear? Sometimes it just seems that way and looks that way, and that's what Ahaz and the people of Judah were dealing with. And as Isaiah was there saying, no, God hasn't failed. So here's what it says. But to both the houses of Israel, a stone to strike and a rock to stumble over, and a snare and a trap for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Many will stumble over them. Then they will fall and be broken. They will even be snared and caught. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples, and I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face even from the house of Jacob. I will even look eagerly for him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are for signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts who dwells on Mount Zion. What does all that mean? I want us to see in this that when it seems that God's purposes have failed, they haven't. Because verse 14 all the way through 17 sounds bad, doesn't it? It sounds really almost hopeless. He's saying that God's presence, Emmanuel, God with us, will be a sign. Who is Emmanuel, God with us? It's Jesus. He is a sign. And verses 14 and 15 sound very bad. To both houses of Israel, so the northern and southern kingdom that we saw on the map, to both of them, he will be a rock they will trip over. He will offend them. It sounds bad, right? Wait a minute, they're God's chosen people. How is this possible? It seems like it's going to fail, but then you get to verse 18 and he says, behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are for signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts who dwell on Mount Zion. We got to see something here in verse 18. This is actually the Messiah talking. This is Jesus talking. How do I know that? Good question. Because you can't see it at first. But actually in Hebrews chapter 2, we are told that this is Jesus talking. And Hebrews chapter 2, starting verse 11, it says, for both he who sanctifies or sets apart and those who are set apart or sanctified are all from one Father, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brethren in the midst of the congregation. I will sing your praise. And again, look at this in verse 13. I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children whom God is giving me. He's quoting this verse from Isaiah 8. He's quoting this. And he's speaking on behalf of the Messiah, Jesus, saying he's not ashamed to call those of you who have put your faith in him brothers. And he's quoting this from Isaiah chapter 8, where God was saying this to the people of Judah, saying he has called out a remnant. It looks like all of you are not hoping in the Messiah, in Jesus, but there are some among Israel who God is preserving. Even to this day, God's purposes for Israel won't fail. Romans 9, verses 31 through 33. We see that Israel pursued a law of righteousness, but did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith. But as though it were by works, they stumbled over the stumbling stone. Just as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and he who believes in me will not be disappointed. And he goes on in Romans 9 through 11 to say, it looks like God has failed with Israel, but he hasn't. He has a promise for a future, and he will give them not only that land that Assyria was closing in on, much more land, and not only a land, but a hope that will never fail. A ruler we'll see in a few weeks who is perfect with complete justice, who knows your problems and knows how to solve them. But many will stumble over this. When it seems like God's purposes have failed, though, they haven't. They haven't. And it may just be a remnant of Israel who even believes that Jesus is the Messiah, but God always has a remnant. Now, for you, that's good news. You've seen the stories of Israel in the Bible, right? Maybe even secretly you've judged them pretty hard. How did you not know better? What about you? Have you made plans, purposes without God? Not enjoying the gentleness and joy of his presence? The good news for you is God isn't finished. And what he started in you, he will complete. And that leads us to our third and final principle in verses 19 through 22. Verses 19 through 22, we see that we are in danger of settling just for whatever works when it comes to our problems in life. We're in danger of settling for whatever works when we make choices without rejoicing in God's presence. So maybe you've heard everything I've already said today, and you're just like, okay, you're kind of like beating a horse here, dead horse here. I mean, all you're saying is pay attention to God's presence. That is all I'm saying. I'm saying find your delight in his presence. It's a very simple message. And maybe you're saying, okay, is it really that important? I get it. It's a good concept. I'm saying this is so important that if you don't understand it, you are in actually danger of just settling for other ways that the world will tell you will work to solve your problem. And they will look like they'll work, but they will not last. They are behind it empty. And that's what we see. Their thing was, verse 19, they were being told to consult the mediums and the spiritists who whisper and mutter. But then he says, should not a people consult their God? Should they consult the dead on behalf of the living? And so we see here that the contrast of verse 19 and 20 is they're being told, hey, there's another way. You're sitting here in Judah. You're in danger of losing your land. Ahaz, you're going to be taken off the throne. Self-preservation, you better make this deal. That's your only hope. You will be shamed. You will be embarrassed. If you don't make this deal with Aram and with Israel, you're toast. There are other voices coming in. And then there's more narratives added on top of that. You say, don't trust us? Go talk to your dead grandpa. Go find a medium. They will put you in touch with your dead grandpa. You're sitting here wishing you could just talk to him and he could give you wise counsel and advice. Go talk to a medium, a spiritist, a psychic. They'll tell you. They'll help you see what's the wisest thing to do. And it was making some sense to them. And they're like, yeah, because they've already lived and died and they could tell us all the regrets they would have had. They would have given us wise advice and it's making sense to them. And so here's God saying, don't listen to that. It might seem like it'll work. It might seem like it's a good idea. It's not. And you will settle for these other ideas. Maybe you listen to that one and say, I would never fall for that. But there are others you will fall for. There are others that may just seem, okay, this is a good way to solve this problem. This is a good way to deal with this frustration. This is a good way to just drown out feelings of hopelessness or fears that come in. I'll just ignore it. I'll just get busier. Have you ever fallen for one of those two? Just get busier. If I just do more stuff, then I won't ever have to sit with those feelings. Be careful. Because we are in danger of settling for just whatever will work when we make choices without rejoicing in God's presence. As we think about this morning, I just want us to sit for a few minutes. Let God search our hearts. Because this is a simple message this morning. That either you make choices rejoicing in God's presence, in the gentleness that He offers you from a place of peace that surpasses understanding, that when you're there and that His glorious throne on high is the place of your sanctuary, you look at the problem, you say, that seems impossible, but God, you're bigger. And you see your joy isn't robbed from you, and your hope isn't diminished. Or you don't. And then what are you left with? Frustration comes, hopelessness comes, anger comes, frustrations come. You will be tempted to solve problems without God. How are you doing? Are there fears that you have that you need to lay down at God's feet this morning? Are there feelings of hopelessness that you need to stop ignoring and say, God, replace this hopelessness with your promises, with your truth that I find in your presence? Maybe what you need to lay down this morning is your busyness. that you will actually be still before God and say, God, when I pray, maybe it's too surface level. Maybe I didn't press into the Holy of Holies to find the grace and the help for my need. And so I've been left thinking that there isn't any and settling for something else. So where are you this morning? Let's just take a minute in silence and just pray through that.